There are stories that flicker at the edges of history, whispers buried under official silence, rumors half-remembered by old men who refuse to speak on record, and documents that seem to evaporate the moment someone tries to verify them. But among all the shadowed tales of vanished treasure and wartime secrets, few carry the same weight, or danger, as the story of the Lost Gold Convoy. It begins, as so many forgotten stories do, in the final, collapsing months of the Second World War, when Europe was burning from one end to the other, and governments, armies, and entire nations were scrambling to survive the final reckoning. Yet this story is not only about gold. It is about fear. It is about betrayal. And it is about a decision made in desperation, one that would set off a chain of events stretching from the icy forests of Eastern Europe to the quiet corners of modern-day archives, where the truth remains stubbornly out of reach. To understand why a convoy carrying billions in gold vanished without a trace, we must first understand the world in which it disappeared, a world drowning in uncertainty, a world where plans changed by the hour, loyalties wavered, and the difference between salvation and annihilation could hinge on a single rumor. Our story begins on a frozen January morning in 1945. The war was all but decided. Nazi Germany was crumbling beneath the weight of Allied bombardment and Soviet encirclement. The once formidable Wehrmacht had been reduced to a patchwork of exhausted veterans, terrified conscripts, and boys barely old enough to hold rifles. Yet, even in defeat, High Command clung to one last delusion: that if they could just endure a little longer, if they could regroup, redirect, or rearm in some miraculous way, their thousand-year Reich might somehow limp through the storm. But for Adolf Hitler and his remaining inner circle, the question was no longer how to win the war. It was how to control the narrative of their downfall, and how to prevent their enemies from seizing what little remained of their empire's wealth. By early 1945, Germany's financial reserves had reached a critical breaking point. Years of looting across Europe had built a mountain of stolen gold, currency, jewels, and priceless artifacts, but much of it had already been transported out of Berlin, hidden deep in mines and forests, guarded by units whose names never appeared in official records. Still, there was more, much more, a final shipment, the one whispered about in classified memoranda, guarded by men who had been chosen not only for their loyalty, but for their willingness to disappear from history if necessary. This, according to scattered, half-erased wartime diaries, is the shipment that would become known as the Lost Gold Convoy. The most reliable account of its origins comes from a man named Colonel Dietrich Stahl, a mid-level officer in the Reich Main Security Office. History recorded little about him. Too little, some researchers argue. His surviving correspondence is dry, clinical, and obsessed with logistics. But hidden between the lines is a striking realization. Stahl had been given a task unlike any other officer in the collapsing Third Reich. His assignment was to organize the evacuation of a special consignment from the outskirts of Breslau, modern-day Wrocław, then a fortress city preparing for one of the longest and most brutal sieges of the Eastern Front. At the time, Breslau was a city of desperation. Hitler had declared it a Festung, a fortress that must be held at all costs. Tens of thousands of civilians were trapped inside its walls, bracing for the Soviet storm already rumbling beyond the Oder River. Military engineers tore up streets to build barricades. Anti-aircraft crews slept beside their guns. Families hid in basements so cold their breath froze in front of them. And in the middle of that chaos, a convoy of sealed trucks, guarded by an unusually large detachment of SS troops, began assembling in the shadow of a munitions warehouse near the western edge of the city. The official manifest, if one ever truly existed, never survived. But eyewitnesses, interviewed decades later, described the trucks as armored, reinforced, and meticulously inspected. Soldiers who had never before been stationed in Breslau were suddenly everywhere, patrolling the perimeter, guarding locked crates, and monitoring local workers who were ordered to load supplies under threat of execution. One witness, a teenage mechanic at the time, recalled seeing heavy chests that required 6 men to lift, each marked with insignias he didn't recognize. Symbols, he said, looked older than the Reich itself. When asked decades later what he thought was inside them, the old man only shrugged. Gold, probably. Or something worse. But this was no simple evacuation. The Soviets were closing in from every direction. The convoy, if it was to escape, had only a narrow corridor westward, a freezing road slick with ice, littered with wreckage, and constantly within reach of Red Army scouts. This is where the story begins to fracture, where official history and rumor begin to collide. Some documents claim the convoy departed Breslau on January 21, 1945. Others place its departure weeks later, as late as March, when the noose around the city was already strangling tight. Still others claim the convoy never left at all, arguing that the trucks were decoys, meant only to lure Soviet observers away from a different secret evacuation, hidden somewhere beneath the city itself. But the most compelling evidence, the most consistent across all testimonies, points to the early hours before dawn on a moonless January night. That night, the convoy of vehicles, between 7 and 12 trucks depending on the source, lined up nose to tail on a frost-covered road heading west. Their engines idled in the darkness, muffled behind canvas-covered grills. Beside them stood 40, perhaps 50 SS guards, all hand-picked, all sworn to secrecy. Among them, according to a later discovered personal letter, was a young lieutenant named Erich Wolfram, one of the few names connected to the convoy that appears in more than one account. Wolfram was 25 years old, idealistic, and deeply loyal to the Reich, at least in the beginning. His letters home reveal a man torn between pride in his orders and a growing unease about what, exactly, he had been entrusted to protect. In one letter, written just 3 days before the convoy's departure, Wolfram hints at something extraordinary, something he had never seen before, something he was not allowed to speak of. "Mother," he wrote, "I have been assigned to guard something unusual. They say it is of great importance to the future. I do not know what it is. I only know that we must not fail. They tell us that losing it would be worse than losing the war." Those words have troubled historians for decades. What could possibly be so valuable, so vital, that losing it would be considered worse than losing the war itself? Theories abound. Some believe the convoy carried stolen gold, perhaps as much as 150 metric tons, looted from central banks across Europe. Others argue it contained jewels, art, or the secret financial reserves of the Nazi Party. But a smaller, more intriguing group of researchers speculate that the cargo was something else entirely, something still classified, something that governments today remain quietly unwilling to discuss. Whatever the truth, the convoy began its journey under the cover of night, guided only by blackout lamps and the faint glimmer of stars between clouds. Its destination remains one of the story's greatest mysteries. Some say the convoy was heading toward the Alps, where remnants of the Nazi leadership dreamed of establishing an Alpine redoubt, a final stronghold from which they could negotiate or continue resistance. Others claim its goal was far more modest, merely to reach the western bank of the Oder River, where new orders would be waiting. But one detail appears again and again. The convoy was never meant to reach Berlin. It was heading away from the capital, not toward it. Why? Because by January 1945, even the Reich's leadership understood the inevitable. Berlin was doomed. The Soviets would reach it first, and whatever the convoy carried, it could not be allowed to fall into Soviet hands. And so, under a sky heavy with snow, the engines groaned to life. The trucks rolled forward one by one, leaving behind the city of Breslau, its walls trembling under distant artillery fire, heading into a darkness that none of the men realized would soon swallow them whole. For a time, everything went according to plan. The convoy moved steadily, quietly, following a predetermined route known only to a handful of officers. Their orders were strict: maintain silence, keep formation, and under no circumstances open any of the sealed crates. But as they moved deeper into the frozen countryside, a storm began to gather. Some say it was the worst snowstorm of that winter, a blinding torrent of ice and wind that brought visibility down to nearly zero. Others argue that the storm was exaggerated later, used as a convenient explanation for what happened next. But Lieutenant Wolfram's final surviving letter, written hastily and smudged by water damage, mentions one haunting detail. "We have entered the storm. I cannot see the road. Some of the men say this is a bad sign. I try not to listen." Hours later, the convoy would vanish, completely. No wreckage, no bodies, no gold, nothing. Only a trail of questions stretching across 8 decades. For days after the convoy vanished into the blizzard, no one in Breslau knew what had happened to it. Radio silence had been expected. Communications were risky, and the route passed through territory riddled with Soviet patrols. But the absence of any signal at all quickly grew suspicious. When the convoy failed to arrive at its first checkpoint, the officer in charge of coordinating evacuations sent out encrypted messages at staggered intervals. None were answered. At first, the silence could be explained. Equipment failure, interference from the storm, or perhaps the need to avoid enemy detection. But by the third day, excuses grew thin. Something had gone terribly wrong. The few officers who knew of the convoy's cargo, or believed they did, became increasingly frantic. Rumors began spreading among staff that the Soviets had intercepted it. Others whispered that partisan fighters, emboldened by the approaching Red Army, had ambushed the convoy in the forests. But those who knew the route best shook their heads at that suggestion. The forests had been scoured repeatedly in the preceding weeks. Partisans were scattered, disorganized, and struggling to survive. And even if they had attempted an attack, they would have needed heavy equipment and dozens of fighters just to stall the convoy, let alone make it disappear. The truth was far stranger. It would take nearly 50 years before the first solid clue surfaced, long after most of the men involved were dead, and long after the world had moved on from the chaos of 1945. But long before those revelations emerged, the seeds of suspicion were already forming. Back in Breslau, Colonel Stahl received a sealed communiqué from a superior whose name has been redacted in every surviving copy. The message was brief, almost absurdly so, and yet it spoke volumes. It read simply, "Failure unacceptable. Locate convoy. No record of loss permitted." The phrase, "no record of loss permitted," would haunt historians long after the war. What could be so important that its disappearance had to be erased from history itself? Stahl, who understood more than he ever admitted, moved quickly. He assembled a second group of SS officers, men even more loyal, more discreet, and more desperate than the first. Their mission was to retrace the convoy's route, locate it, retrieve the cargo if possible, and eliminate any witnesses who might compromise the operation. But there was a problem. The storm had obliterated every track, every footprint, every clue. The countryside was buried beneath layers of white, the roads unrecognizable, and the forests transformed into vast, silent cathedrals of ice. Yet still, Stahl pushed forward. His search team reached the first staging area, an abandoned farmhouse used as a navigation checkpoint, but found it deserted. A fire pit still contained scraps of unburned paper and charred timber, suggesting someone had passed through, but the snow gave no indication of when or how many. Further along, at a crossroads near a destroyed rail line, they found something far stranger: the remains of a field telephone line, cut cleanly, as though by a knife. Stahl's men examined it carefully. It had not been severed by the storm. It had not snapped due to weight or age. Someone had cut it deliberately. But why cut a line in the middle of nowhere? And who had done it? The deeper they searched, the stranger the clues became. A ration crate, half buried in snow, stamped with markings consistent with the convoy's supply manifests. A blood-stained glove lying in the middle of a frozen ditch. A single tire track, partially preserved beneath a protective arch of ice, indicating that at least one vehicle had turned sharply off the main road. But there were no bodies, no wreckage, and no trace of the heavy chests loaded into the convoy's trucks. The storm alone could not explain the disappearance, nor could partisans, Soviets, deserters, or any known threat in the region. The trucks had simply evaporated from the face of the earth. Some members of Stahl's team began whispering that the convoy had never left Breslau at all. Others claimed the men had mutinied, killed their officers, and fled with the gold. One officer, after days without sleep, suggested that the convoy had come under friendly fire, annihilated by German units unaware of its purpose. But Stahl knew better. His private journal, not recovered until 1998, contained a single chilling entry written in the days after the convoy's disappearance. "The men are frightened. They sense what I fear. This was not an ambush. This was not an accident. They were taken. Taken." The word stands alone on the page, underlined twice. But taken by whom? To answer that question, we must leave Stahl's desperate search behind and turn instead to the last confirmed sighting of the convoy. A small hamlet known as Grube, little more than a scattering of farmhouses perched on a ridge overlooking a dense patch of forest. At the time, Grube was home to barely 24 families, most of them farmers, who had been living under wartime rationing for years. Soviet advances had forced many to flee, but a few remained, stubborn, determined, or simply too poor to abandon their homes. One of those who stayed behind was Anna Kruger, a widow in her late 50s with no children and no reason to leave. She tended a small herd of goats, kept a stack of firewood higher than the roof of her cottage, and avoided trouble by ignoring both German directives and Soviet leaflets. In 1967, long after the war had ended, she agreed to speak to an amateur historian who had traveled through Poland collecting stories of civilian life under Nazi rule. Her testimony, recorded on an aging reel-to-reel tape, remains one of the most important eyewitness accounts connected to the Lost Gold Convoy. And her story begins on the night the storm arrived. Anna recalled waking to the sound of engines in the distance, a deep, rhythmic growl that reverberated through the frozen walls of her house. At first, she thought it was artillery, or perhaps the Soviets rolling in their tanks. But as the sound grew louder, she realized it was something far more unusual. A line of trucks. She peered through a frost-covered pane of glass and saw faint, flickering lights weaving through the darkness. The storm had already begun, reducing visibility to just a few meters, but she described the lights as moving in a straight line, as though following something I could not see. But what she remembered most clearly were the men. They were exhausted, she said. Their uniforms were covered in ice. Their breath came out in great plumes that vanished the moment they spoke. One of them, a young lieutenant, knocked on her door to ask for directions. Anna remembered his face vividly. He was too young to be carrying such fear in his eyes, she later said. When she described this man to historians, her description matched almost perfectly with photographs of Lieutenant Eric Wolfram. What Wolfram asked her was simple. Was the road ahead safe? Was there a place they could shelter from the storm? Anna told him the truth. The road ahead dipped into a valley known for flooding and poor visibility. In weather like this, she warned, the trucks could easily slip, stall, or vanish completely. Wolfram thanked her, but his eyes kept drifting toward the forest. She asked him what they were carrying. He hesitated. "Something that must not be lost," he finally said. She asked if it was gold. He did not answer. Instead, he looked back at the trucks, at the sealed crates, then whispered something she struggled to hear over the wind. "They told us it would save us," he said, "but I think it will destroy us." Those were the last known words of Lieutenant Eric Wolfram. Anna watched as the convoy pressed on, swallowed by the storm and the darkness. She never saw them again, but she remembered one detail that researchers have always found disturbing. None of the men were speaking to each other. None were smiling, and none looked hopeful. "They walked like men marching toward their graves," she said, and perhaps they were, because just 2 kilometers beyond Grube, the trucks would leave the main road, turning sharply toward the forest, toward a path that did not appear on any official map. Why did they turn? Were they following new orders? Escaping danger? Or did something happen in those final minutes, something Anna never saw, forcing them off their planned route? We may never know. But what we do know is this. That turn was the last confirmed trace of the Lost Gold Convoy. Beyond it lies only speculation, rumor, and silence. As the convoy disappeared into the dense forest beyond Grube, the storm intensified. What began as a heavy snowfall became a full blizzard, an avalanche of wind and ice that swept across the countryside, with the full force of a winter determined to erase every track, every trail, and every witness. But storms, no matter how powerful, leave traces. Human decisions leave patterns, and the men who vanished that night left behind whispers. Fragments passed from villager to soldier, from soldier to officer, from officer to archivist. Each fragment contradicting the last, each claiming to be the final truth. To understand what happened after Grube, we must sift through these conflicting accounts, one by one, until the outline of something larger begins to emerge. The first clue came from a Soviet reconnaissance group operating near the Oder River. Their unit, led by Captain Mikhail Andreev, was tasked with monitoring German troop movements and identifying potential escape routes westward. On the morning after the storm, Andreev and his men stumbled upon something odd. Tracks. Dozens of them. They were faint, almost erased by fresh snow, but clearly visible where the forest canopy had shielded the ground. According to Andreev's declassified report, the tracks were arranged in a long, narrow formation consistent with a military convoy of vehicles, likely heavy trucks. Intriguingly, the tracks veered sharply off the main road, following a narrow dirt path leading deeper into the woods. A path that, according to Soviet maps, led nowhere. Andreev's men followed the trail for nearly half a kilometer before stopping at a small clearing. There, the tracks simply ended, vanished, as though the trucks had lifted off the ground and floated into the air. The men searched the area thoroughly. They found broken branches, traces of oil, and a single boot print belonging to a German soldier. But there was no sign of a battle. No casings. No footprints indicating a struggle. No blood. It was as if the forest had swallowed the convoy whole. Andreev noted in his report, "Vehicle tracks terminate abruptly. No debris. No bodies. This is not consistent with an ambush. It is something else." The report was stamped, filed, and buried in Soviet archives for decades. But Andreev was not the only observer. The next clue came from an unexpected source. A German deserter named Martin Feldman, a low-ranking mechanic who had fled his unit after losing 3 fingers to frostbite. He was captured by Soviet forces 2 days after the storm, cold and delirious, wandering aimlessly through the forest. When interrogated, Feldman claimed he had seen the convoy hours before it disappeared. According to his statement, the trucks had been moving slowly, their engines struggling against the snow. Feldman recognized the insignia on the SS uniforms, though he dared not approach. But what struck him most was the convoy's direction. They were not following the main road at all. Instead, they appeared to be heading toward an abandoned coal mine known locally as Schacht 4, Shaft 4. During the late 1800s, Schacht 4 had been a hub of industrial mining in the region. But by the 1930s, it had been closed due to structural instability. Locals avoided it, claiming the ground around it shifted unpredictably, as though something massive lay buried beneath. Feldman told Soviet interrogators that he heard the convoy's engines roaring near the mine's entrance before the wind drowned them out. He assumed they had taken shelter from the storm. But what he did not know, and what would become vitally important decades later, is that Schacht 4 had been quietly reactivated by Nazi engineers in 1943. Not for mining, for storage. The mine's deepest tunnels had been reinforced with steel beams and concrete, creating a subterranean vault large enough to conceal vehicles, cargo, and possibly even entire research programs. Its existence was known only to a small circle of engineers and SS officers. Even local authorities were unaware of it. In 1994, after reunification, archaeologists discovered remnants of these reinforced corridors, though any evidence of what they once contained had long since been removed or destroyed. But in 1945, the mine would have been the perfect shelter for a convoy carrying something of immense value, and Feldman's testimony, though fragmented, aligns with this possibility. But here is where the story grows darker, because not all testimonies agree. A third witness, A Polish farmer named Stanislaw Morawski claimed he saw the convoy hours after Feldman's sighting. But according to Morawski, the trucks were not heading toward Shocked Fear. They were heading away from it. Morawski lived on a remote patch of farmland 3 kilometers north of the mine, near a series of forest trails used by hunters and forestry workers. On the afternoon after the storm, he stepped outside to check on his livestock when he heard engines approaching. He hid behind a woodpile, watching as a single truck, its canvas torn and flapping in the wind, lurched past. Its tires were caked with ice and mud, its windshield was cracked, and its driver, Morawski insisted, looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Moments later, a second truck passed, then a third, but only 3, not the 7 to 12 trucks reported leaving Breslau, and not the full formation Feldman described near the mine. Morawski saw no guards, no SS officers, no escort vehicles, just 3 battered trucks limping through the forest, as though fleeing something unimaginable. When Morawski stepped out after they had disappeared, he found something peculiar in the snow. A broken wooden crate, half splintered, with markings partially burned off. Inside were small cloth pouches, empty, but stained with a fine dust that glimmered faintly in the fading light. When asked what the dust looked like, Morawski answered simply, "Gold." His statement was dismissed at the time as fantasy, but modern forensic analysis of similar pouches found near wartime storage sites shows that raw gold dust was indeed transported in small canvas bags during the later years of the Reich, when melting infrastructure made the processing of bullion increasingly difficult. If Morawski's account was true, then one chilling conclusion emerges. The convoy had split up. Not all the trucks made it out of the forest, and the survivors were fleeing something. But what? To answer that, we must return once more to the most enigmatic figure in this chapter, Colonel Dietrich Stahl. Stahl's search team eventually reached Shocked Fear. What they found there has been the subject of rampant speculation, conspiracy theories, and heated debate among historians. The official report, what remains of it, is sparse. It states that the mine was empty. No trucks, no cargo, no bodies. But other sources, fragmented diary entries and letters found decades later, hint at something far more disturbing. One passage, written in Stahl's handwriting, reads, "We descended into the lower galleries. The air was thick with dust. Torches revealed nothing but blackness. And yet all of us felt something watching us." Another, even more cryptic. "We found marks on the floor, drag marks, heavy, deep, as though the trucks had been pulled further in. But there was no collapse, no cave-in, no sound." If these accounts are accurate, something, or someone, moved the trucks deeper into the mine long after the storm had ended. But by who? Or for what purpose? These questions would remain unanswered for half a century, until archaeologists discovered a sealed tunnel beneath Shocked Fear in 1994, one that had been intentionally blocked off during the war. Inside that tunnel were metal beams twisted by immense pressure, fragments of wood consistent with heavy freight crates, and something far stranger. Fine traces of gold embedded in the rock walls. Gold that should not have been there. Gold that was never officially recorded by any government, museum, or bank. Gold that matched the impurity signatures of metal smelted in Austria during the late 1930s. The same metal believed to have been part of the Reich's private reserves. This discovery confirmed one truth beyond any doubt. At least part of the Lost Gold Convoy reached Shocked Fear, but none of it ever emerged. And so, as the winter of 1945 raged on, the convoy that had left Breslau, carrying a cargo meant to secure the future of a dying regime, vanished beneath the earth. No one in Berlin ever received confirmation. No one in Breslau ever saw the men again. And no government, German, Soviet, or Allied, ever claimed responsibility. From this moment forward, the trail grows colder. The storm passes, the forest heals, and history moves on. But the gold remains missing, and the truth behind its disappearance remains concealed in the darkness of an abandoned mine, the shifting archives of forgotten regimes, and the memories of the few who witnessed the convoy's final journey. The mystery is just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of the convoy's disappearance, the question that consumed those few aware of its mission was not the gold, nor the cargo, nor even the political consequences. It was the men. Because unlike gold, unlike documents, unlike crates, men leave echoes, in letters, in reports, in rumors whispered across campfires at night. They leave behind fear, guilt, and the weight of decisions made under the collapse of an empire. And the men assigned to the Lost Gold Convoy were not ordinary soldiers. They were chosen, each selected for a different reason, yet bound together by a single, unspoken truth. None of them were expected to return. Some were chosen for loyalty, some for silence, some for the sins they needed buried, others because they had seen too much already. History remembers them only as a list of names recorded in a manifest stamped Geheime Reichssache, top secret. But a list of names is not a story. A list of names tells us nothing of their fears, their motives, their loyalties, or the dark paths that led them toward the final winter of the Reich. To understand how and why these men vanished, we must go back to the weeks before their final mission, when Berlin still believed salvation was possible, and when those in power believed that gold could buy them a future. Among the men assigned to the convoy, 3 stand out, 3 whose stories survived long enough for historians to reconstruct, 3 whose pasts illuminate the shadowy decisions that shaped this doomed operation. Their lives did not intersect until January 1945, but their destinies were fastened together the moment they accepted their sealed orders. Let us begin with the one who carried the heaviest burden, Lieutenant Erich Wolfram. Erich Wolfram was 24 years old when he received his assignment. Far too young for the haunted expression Anna Kruger described, and far too young to hold the kind of secrets his superiors demanded he carry. Before the war, Wolfram had been a student of engineering in Dresden. Quiet, precise, and gifted with an analytical mind, he had been expected to join Germany's expanding industrial sector. Instead, he entered the army at the age of 19, swept up in the tide of patriotic fervor that surrounded the early victories. But by 1943, the war had changed him. Wolfram had been stationed near Smolensk during the brutal retreat from the east. He had seen men frozen upright in the snow, eyes open as though staring at something that refused to let them go even in death. He had seen commanders issue orders that doomed entire units, and he had seen, with his own eyes, the consequences of the regime's darkest policies, things no young soldier should have had to witness. By 1944, he no longer believed in victory. By 1945, he no longer believed in the cause. His superiors knew this, and yet curiously, they did not punish him. Instead, they transferred him into a communications division, where his intelligence and obedience could be contained. It was there, buried in a sea of logistical paperwork, that he came across a set of documents that would seal his fate. Documents referencing a strategic relocation asset. Documents stamped with signatures far above his pay grade. Documents that mentioned a single word again and again: reserve. At the time, Wolfram did not understand what he was reading, but he understood enough to know that it was dangerous. Too dangerous. The Reich was preparing something, not an offensive, not a weapon, but a relocation of wealth so vast that its very existence contradicted all propaganda about final victory. Wolfram tried to remain silent, but his hesitation did not go unnoticed. 5 weeks before the convoy departed, 2 SS officers arrived at his barracks. They did not question him. They did not accuse him. They merely informed him that his skills were required for a special transport operation. He understood immediately. He was being removed, not executed, no. That would attract attention, but reassigned to something from which he would not return. His diary, what survives of it, contains only one line from that night. "They want me to vanish quietly." That single sentence would become a prophecy. The second figure tied to the convoy's fate is Karl Messenger, a man whose life story reads like a cautionary tale from a dying nation. Messenger was not a soldier by choice. He was a truck driver, plain and simple. He had spent most of his adult life transporting coal, timber, and construction materials across Saxony. When the war began, he assumed he would be exempt from service. After all, workers in essential industries were usually spared. But in 1942, during a crackdown on black market trade, Messenger was arrested for transporting food without ration stamps. Under normal circumstances, the punishment would have been mild. But 1942 was not normal. The Eastern Front was collapsing, fuel shortages were spreading, and the Army's Transportation Corps was desperate for experienced drivers. So, when Messenger stood before a military tribunal, they gave him a choice: prison or the front. He chose the front. Over the next 2 years, Messenger became one of the Army's most reliable drivers, partly because he had no illusions about heroism. He knew trucks, he knew roads, he knew engines, and he knew that surviving the war meant staying far away from glory. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. In December 1944, Messenger's unit was tasked with transporting crates of seized valuables from Poland to a processing center in Bavaria. No one told him what the crates contained. No one needed to. Men who had spent years hauling meaningless cargo know instantly when they are carrying something important, because important cargo always brings guards, secrecy, and fear. When one of the escort officers caught Messenger glancing at a crate too long, he made an assumption, an incorrect one, but deadly nonetheless. He assumed the driver had become curious. Curious men are dangerous. Curious men talk. Curious men vanish. So when the Lost Gold Convoy was assembled in Breslau, Messenger's name appeared on the roster. A convenient assignment, a quiet disposal, and a man who had run out of luck. The third man whose presence shaped the convoy's fate was Helmut Kruger, an SS officer feared as much by his own men as by the enemies he fought. Kruger had been stationed in multiple occupied territories and was implicated, though never formally charged, in numerous acts of brutality. By 1945, even the SS considered him unstable. He drank heavily, volunteered for assignments others refused, and clung to a warped sense of loyalty that bordered on self-destruction. But Kruger had one quality the SS valued: absolute obedience. When the convoy was assembled, Berlin needed someone ruthless enough to ensure the cargo reached its destination, someone willing to eliminate dissent without hesitation. Kruger was perfect. But Kruger possessed something else, something far more volatile, an unshakable belief that the gold was cursed. According to a surviving letter written by one of his subordinates, Kruger claimed he had seen a report months earlier describing a failed attempt to move similar cargo out of Ukraine. The convoy had been attacked, not by Soviets, but by something unseen, something that caused panic among the guards and left no bodies behind. His men dismissed this as drunken rambling, but the fear behind his eyes was unmistakable. And so, when the Lost Gold Convoy rolled out of Breslau, 3 men carried 3 different burdens. Wolfram, the soldier who knew too much; Messenger, the driver with no way out; Kruger, the officer convinced he was transporting damnation itself. Their paths would converge in the blinding storm outside Grube. Their fates would vanish beneath the earth at shocked fear. And their ghosts, whether literal or metaphorical, would haunt every investigation that followed for the next 70 years. The convoy's disappearance had always hovered in that uncanny borderland between a tragic wartime mishap and something far more deliberate, an operation buried so deeply that even those who orchestrated it could never again acknowledge its existence. But as we push further into this chapter, the pattern begins to take shape. It's like watching a mural come together, scattered brushstrokes suddenly aligning to reveal the shadowy outline of an intention to hide something, an intention to rewrite the fate of 10 trucks, an intention to erase the gold, and perhaps an intention to eliminate the men who transported it. There is an easy explanation for every mystery, but the simplest one is often deployed hastily, almost by force, to prevent people from asking the harder questions. That is exactly what happened in the days after the convoy vanished. The official line released to regional authorities stated the following: Contact lost with transport column during severe weather disruption. Possible mechanical breakdown or enemy interception. Rescue efforts ongoing. But embedded officers, though the ones who had sat in actual operational headquarters, later said something else. There was no severe weather. There was no evidence of a breakdown. And at that time, the enemy was nowhere near the route. In fact, intelligence logs show the nearest enemy patrols were over 40 kilometers away and moving in the opposite direction. So, if we strip away the official excuses, only 3 possibilities remain. Someone deliberately misreported the convoy's route. Someone intercepted the radio transmissions. Someone inside the command structure ensured the trucks were never found. Not lost, hidden. When you dig into wartime archives long enough, you learn a strange truth. The most important people often leave the faintest footprints. That is certainly the case for General Kazimierz Wolnicki, allegedly the strategic coordinator overseeing logistics for the region where the gold transport operated. Official biographies list him as an administrative officer with limited operational authority, but eyewitnesses describe something entirely different. They said he commanded a private staff. They said he held late-night meetings in secure rooms guarded by military police. They said he had files on operations that weren't listed anywhere on paper. Here is the part that chills anyone reading the documents today. Wolnicki's name disappears from the surviving wartime logbooks 2 days before the convoy left the depot. No transfer, no reassignment, no death. Just missing. Almost as if whatever he was involved in ended with the disappearance. So when Ilya, our researcher, traced his last confirmed appearance, it led to a local administrative building, where an orderly recalled seeing the general arrive with 2 unknown civilians wearing diplomatic-grade identification. One spoke German, one had a British accent. They stayed in Wolnicki's office for 3 hours. The next day he was gone, and the day after that, the gold convoy rolled out. Coincidence? Or coordination? Most wartime radio transmissions dissolve into static, but a single fragment, found decades later on a forgotten reel in a military archive, survived. It's incomplete, damaged, barely audible, yet what remains is enough to raise every hair on the back of your neck. The recording picks up at 1814 hours, an hour before the convoy departed. Repeat, directive confirmed. No escort added. They are not to know. Yes, I understand. Keep it quiet. Whoever spoke those words was not from the convoy itself. The phrasing suggests someone high enough to override standard procedure. Someone with the authority to deliberately weaken security. Standard protocol, especially for precious cargo, required at least 3 escort units. The gold convoy left with none. Imagine that. 10 heavily loaded trucks, each carrying a fortune, driving through contested territory with 0 armed protection. This was not a logistical error. It was an engineered vulnerability, the kind only someone on the inside could create. Every unsolved wartime riddle attracts its own folklore. But occasionally, rumors cling to a real name and won't let go. In this case, the merchant, not a soldier, not a politician, not even an officer in disguise. According to border intelligence memos, the merchant was an intermediary, a negotiator operating between governments, resistance groups, and sometimes enemy officers. His talent lay in identifying opportunities and extracting fortune from chaos. The gold, some said, was never meant to reach a vault. It was meant to be sold, or traded, or leveraged. But here's the part that rings loudest. Reports place the merchant within 20 kilometers of the convoy route on the day of its disappearance. He traveled with a small retinue and possessed authorization documents from 3 different governments, none of which knew about the others. And in a note found among confiscated papers, a border officer wrote, he asked specifically about the trucks. He knew the departure time, but the cargo was supposed to be secret. If the merchant knew, who told him, and why? Convoy routes are chosen for 3 reasons: safety, speed, and strategic relevance. But the route the Lost Gold Convoy took matches none of those. Instead of hugging the safer southern passage, cleared of enemy patrols, the trucks went northward, toward a dense forested zone. There were two problems with this. The ground was too soft for heavy vehicles. Visibility in that terrain made ambush inevitable. Why would a skilled commander choose such a suicidal path? He wouldn't, unless someone above him ordered it. And here's the unsettling part. Ilya found a single surviving document, stamped with a commander's identifier code, rerouting the trucks from the safe pathway to the northern one. But under ultraviolet examination, the signature box revealed something damning. It was blank. And worse, the order was printed on a typewriter model that didn't exist in the commander's headquarters. So, who issued the route change? Someone with access. Someone with authority. Someone who knew the convoy would drive into the perfect location to disappear. Near the end of our research, we found one surviving witness, an elderly man named Jarek, who had been stationed 20 kilometers from the area on the night of the disappearance. His testimony was frail, fragmented, and emotional, but his recollection contained one detail we couldn't ignore. He said he saw trucks, not destroyed, not burning, driving, slowly, lights off, escorted by two unmarked vehicles. When he shouted to alert his superior, he was ordered back inside immediately. The next morning, he was told he hadn't seen anything at all. A month later, he was transferred. When asked what he believed really happened, his answer was direct. They didn't lose the gold. They took it. By this point in the investigation, the pieces of the puzzle begin to align. A vanished general, foreign civilians with diplomatic clearance, an unescorted fortune, a fabricated route order, a mysterious intermediary known as the merchant, a witness seeing the trucks under unknown control. This is no longer the outline of a disaster. It's the anatomy of a secret deal. A deal involving gold, governments, betrayal, and a convoy that walked willingly into a blind spot engineered from the top. But what happened next? Where did the trucks go? Who took possession? And what became of the men inside them? Those answers lie not on maps or official records, but in the recovered diaries of one man who was on the convoy itself. A man who survived, but was never supposed to. There are moments in history when the truth does not survive in official records, or in government archives, or in the testimony of powerful men. Sometimes, the truth endures only because one ordinary person writes it down in a moment of fear, desperation, or defiance. The Lost Gold Convoy is one such moment. For decades, rumors claimed that someone from inside the convoy lived, a single survivor who escaped the fate of the others. Some spoke of him as a deserter, others called him a traitor. Still, others insisted he was not a soldier at all, but a thief who stole from the dead. But in the archive where Ilya and I found the now famous metal strongbox, hidden beneath a collapsed shelving unit, inside a storage bunker untouched since the late 1940s, the truth surfaced. Inside that box, under rusted tools and mold-eaten cloth, were two weather-damaged notebooks, a pencil stub, and a dog tag. The name on the dog tag matched a missing-in-action transport mechanic, Marek Novák. He was never listed among those found. He was never confirmed dead. He simply vanished, like the trucks. But the handwriting in the notebooks matched his barracks records, and the story inside was unlike anything we expected. The journal begins without ceremony. Marek wasn't trying to write history. He was simply trying to steady his thoughts. The opening pages read like a quiet confession from a man who understood something was wrong, even if he couldn't articulate why. We loaded the trucks 3 hours before sunrise. No officers supervising except Captain D, who looked tired and unsure of himself. He kept checking over his shoulder. I've never seen him so nervous. That detail is important. Captain D, commanding officer of the convoy, was known as disciplined, rigid, unflinching. Yet in the days before the disappearance, multiple soldiers whispered that he had become distracted, confused, pressured. Marek continues, "The crates were heavier than any gold I've ever handled, and the seals were new. But something else. When I knocked on one of the crates, it sounded as if something wasn't fully packed inside, like metal shifting. Gold is dense, solid, silent. Whatever Marek heard wasn't consistent with gold ingots. It suggested the cargo was different, or not uniform, or partly concealed. Was it gold mixed with something else? Documents? Artifacts? Currency? Or was the gold only a fraction of the truth? We'll return to that, but not yet. In the journal's entries for the night before departure, Marek describes something that aligns eerily with what we uncovered in classified papers. 2 civilians arrived at the loading site. They wore no uniforms. They gave no names. And they carried authorization badges unlike any the soldiers had ever seen. Marek writes, "One spoke German, the other, I think, British. They inspected the crates, but only briefly. They didn't speak to us. They spoke only to the captain, quietly, while he kept rubbing his forehead like he was in pain." This is the same pair mentioned earlier in reports about General Wolnitsky's final movements. The same pair believed to have coordinated something behind the scenes. And the same pair spotted days later heading north, as if tracking the convoy's intended route. But Marek includes a detail the official records never mention. When they left, the captain watched them until they disappeared. I overheard him whisper, "God help us if they're right." Right. About what? The journal does not yet say, but the dread in those early entries tells us everything. When the trucks rolled out in the pale light of dawn, Marek described an atmosphere that felt staged, as though everyone was performing a role in a play whose script had been forced upon them. No escort, no armored cars, just us drivers and a single command jeep. This is madness. I asked Jarek if he thought something was wrong. He said, "Keep your mouth shut. Orders changed." Orders changed. Those same mysterious orders that redirected the convoy through dangerous northern terrain. Marek describes the early hours of travel as tense but uneventful. The road was stable, the weather was clear. The men joked, smoked, argued, the way soldiers do when monotony returns after moments of fear. But around midday, as the convoy entered the forested region, Marek noticed the first deeply unsettling sign. I saw markings on the trees, not military markings, symbols, circles crossed by lines. Someone has been tracking something out here, or warning someone. Back then, partisan groups used coded symbols to guide allies or warn them of danger. But the symbols Marek described do not match any known partisan system. They match something older, more obscure, something associated not with resistance fighters, but with smugglers. Smugglers who operated long before the war, and who used hidden forest paths to move contraband across borders. Paths only they knew. Paths a convoy could vanish into. The first sign of danger came around dusk. Marek writes, 2 vehicles appeared behind us. Civilian lights. No insignias. At first I thought they were partisans, or maybe our escort finally caught up. But they kept a distance. They followed us for almost an hour. These vehicles matched the description given by the elderly soldier who later insisted he saw the convoy being shepherded under someone else's control. And what Marek writes next is our first moment of direct convergence. The captain radioed headquarters asking if reinforcements had been sent. No reply. Static only. He tried 3 times. This is where everything begins to unravel. Wireless logs in the archives confirm the captain attempted contact at that exact time, but all HQ transmissions were being routed elsewhere, deliberately intercepted or jammed. Someone didn't want the convoy talking to anyone. The journal describes a moment that appears in no report, no archive, and no official record, but is consistent with the terrain maps and the convoy's last known coordinates. Just after nightfall, the trucks stopped. Trees across the road, freshly cut, not fallen naturally. A roadblock. Man-made, positioned precisely, at a bend where visibility was worst and escape nearly impossible. The captain ordered the drivers to stay inside their vehicles while he approached the obstruction. And that is when everything changed. Marek describes hearing a voice calling out from the darkness, not in the local language, not in German, but in heavily accented English. Cut the engines, hands where they can be seen. Then another voice, from deeper in the woods. Do as instructed. No one fires. Unmarked vehicles rolled up behind them, Flashlights swept across windshields. Someone approached with quiet, controlled steps. Then, Marek writes, I saw him, the merchant. This is the first, and only, eyewitness description of the mysterious figure long rumored to be involved. And Marek's description is startling. Tall, thin, coat too clean for these roads, gloves. He looked like he was strolling through a marketplace, not a forest, and he smiled, as if he had been waiting for us. The captain shouted something we cannot fully decipher from the torn page, but Marek records the reply clearly. Please, Captain, the man said. We are all on the same side tonight. Then came the words that still echo through the case. The cargo changes hands now. Panic rippled through the drivers. Some tried to flee their vehicles. Others shouted. But armed men emerged from the trees, disciplined, quiet, well-coordinated. These were not bandits, not partisans. They knew military procedure. Then Marek describes witnessing something that confirms deep internal betrayal. The captain lowered his weapon. He didn't resist. He stepped aside when the merchant put a hand on his shoulder. The captain looked defeated. This is the same captain who had begged headquarters for contact. The same captain who kept glancing toward the horizon before departure. The same captain who had been visited by the German and British civilians. Now he surrendered the entire convoy without a fight. But why? The journal answers that question with chilling simplicity. I heard him whisper to the merchant. They promised my family would be safe. This is the moment where the conspiracy is no longer speculation, no longer rumor, no longer myth. This is the moment the Lost Gold Convoy became the Lost Men. The drivers were ordered out of their trucks. Their dog tags were confiscated. Their hands were bound. Marek scribbles. I knew then that we would not see morning. One soldier tried to break free and was shot instantly, execution style. The rest were forced into the back of the last truck, except Marek. Why? Because of a malfunction, a coincidence that saved his life. He had stayed behind to fix a loose fuel connection, lagging several meters away from the headlights. When the ambush took place, he threw himself into a ditch, covered in mud, lying motionless. He watched as the trucks, their engines now controlled by the unknown men, began to turn around. Not forward, not deeper into the forest. Back the way they came, but up a narrow side path invisible from the main road. A path Marek had never seen before. A path only smugglers, or someone using their maps, would know. And here, in the journal's most haunting line, he writes, the trucks drove away without us, without the drivers, without the captain. The gold was gone, the men were gone. I was the only one left. Marek stayed in the ditch for what felt like hours, frozen to the earth, his ears straining to catch every sound. Snow fell silently, muffling everything. But he could still hear the faint hum of engines as the trucks disappeared down the hidden path. Somewhere ahead, the forest swallowed them, and with it, the men of the Lost Gold Convoy. When the silence returned, he crawled back toward the main road, shaking, numb, and unsure if what he had witnessed was real. The first thought in his mind was instinctual, survive. The second, impossible to ignore, tell someone. But who? The roads were abandoned, headquarters unreachable, and the storm still raging. And in that frozen isolation, he understood the most terrifying truth. No one would believe him. By morning, Marek was walking alone through the snow. He avoided the main road, taking side trails that he had memorized from his childhood. Every step he took felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the men who had been stolen from him. Every tree, every mound of snow seemed to watch him, as though the forest itself had become an accomplice to the disappearance. Eventually, he reached Grube, the small hamlet Anna Kruger had lived in. He recognized her house from the faint light shining through the frost-covered windows. Marek stumbled to her door, desperate for warmth, for any sign that the world beyond this forest still existed. Anna would later recall seeing him, pale and trembling, his clothes ripped, eyes wild with disbelief. When asked what had happened, Marek could only shake his head. He muttered fragments. The trucks, gone. All gone. And for the first time since the convoy's departure, he realized he had become part of the story. Not a witness, but a survivor, burdened with knowledge that could never fully be shared. What Marek didn't know, and what would remain hidden for decades, was that the trucks had not been destroyed, ambushed, or buried under snow. They were moved, deep within the forest, down narrow, abandoned logging paths. The convoy had been shepherded into a location that existed only in clandestine maps and whispers. A concealed network of underground tunnels, warehouses, and makeshift vaults constructed during the war for the Reich's most secret operations. These tunnels were known to only a handful of officers, engineers, and intermediaries. The merchant, the man Marek had seen, had orchestrated every movement. His unmarked vehicles, his authority, his precision, all indicated pre-planning on a scale that far surpassed the chaotic retreating German army. And the men who had vanished that night? They were not killed in combat. They were taken to ensure the operation remained secret. Their fates were controlled by a conspiracy designed to erase their existence along with the gold they transported. In Marek's journal, he writes of hearing rumors, even in the small villages, as he traveled back. People say the trucks never stopped moving. They say the men were led by strangers. They say the gold was split, hidden, and carried to the west. No one knows who took it. No one dares ask. By now, Marek understood something vital. The gold and the men had disappeared not because of nature or war or accident, but because someone with power had decided they must. Marek's journal ends abruptly. The last pages are water-damaged, the ink smeared, leaving only fragmented sentences. The merchant spoke. Promises to the captain. Trucks moving. Never see them. I must hide. Must survive. Must tell. His handwriting becomes jagged, desperate, almost illegible in places. And then the notebook stops. No mention of what happened to him immediately afterward. Historical records suggest Marek eventually returned to a village outside Breslau. He lived quietly for decades, never attempting to reclaim his military records, never claiming a pension, never speaking publicly. The war ended. Governments changed. Borders shifted. But Marek carried the truth in silence. And this is what makes his account so important. It is the first direct evidence that the disappearance of the Lost Gold Convoy was not a random event. It was a carefully executed operation, a secret no one wanted documented, and a crime whose witnesses were selected with terrifying precision. The survivor's account, combined with other fragments from soldiers, villagers, and intelligence officers, paints a clear picture. The convoy was intercepted in a controlled ambush, not by enemy forces, not by the elements, but by unknown actors with pre-existing knowledge. The trucks were taken to an underground location, probably Shocked Fear or a similar facility, beyond maps, beyond oversight, beyond law. The men were removed from the operation, some killed, some imprisoned, some possibly coerced into silence. The gold was never intended to reach any bank or vault officially recognized, but instead to be redistributed, sold, or otherwise exploited by parties unknown. Decades later, modern researchers investigating Shocked Fear discovered subtle signs consistent with Marek's account. Tracks partially filled with snow but artificially smoothed, indicating the convoy's movement was intentional. Broken crates, consistent with heavy cargo being unloaded in haste. Metallic residues in the walls of tunnels, suggesting storage of high-value materials. It is here, in the darkness of hidden tunnels, that the intersection of greed, power, and secrecy becomes clear. And yet, despite all this, Marek's account leaves a lingering question that history has yet to answer. Who ultimately benefited from the gold? Was it the merchant, acting for private gain? Was it Allied intelligence, manipulating chaos for strategic advantage? Or did it vanish into the shadows, passing through a chain of intermediaries, leaving only mystery in its wake? If Marek Novák was the eyes of history, the network that orchestrated the disappearance of the convoy was the hand. Invisible, meticulous, and ruthlessly efficient, It operated in the shadows where ordinary men feared to tread. To understand the fate of the Lost Gold Convoy, we must trace this web of intermediaries: diplomats, spies, rogue officers, and enigmatic operatives, whose coordination transcended borders, armies, and allegiances. The convoy did not vanish because of chaos or chance. It vanished because someone had planned it. Someone had the foresight, the intelligence, and the audacity to take gold from the collapsing heart of the Reich and ensure no one ever traced it. This network, known only in fragments across declassified reports, survivor accounts, and rumors, had one defining characteristic: total discretion. At the center was the figure we first encountered in Marek's journal, the merchant. Decades of speculation had reduced him to myth, a phantom responsible for the theft, a shadow walking between nations. But archival research reveals he was far more than a lone opportunist. The merchant was, in fact, a liaison between multiple factions. Rogue SS officers desperate to secure wealth outside of official channels, foreign intelligence operatives seeking to redirect the Reich's assets for their government's or personal advantage, private financiers and industrialists waiting to launder the gold into post-war reconstruction schemes. Each faction had its own agenda, yet all converged on the same objective: intercept the convoy, control the cargo, and erase any trace of the men who had transported it. Marek's descriptions of the unmarked vehicles, the precise timing of the ambush, and the smooth handling of the trucks all point to pre-existing coordination. The merchant was not improvising. He was executing a meticulously timed operation, down to the minute. Documents discovered decades later reveal that the merchant did not operate alone. Several foreign operatives were present in the Breslau region in January 1945, some under diplomatic cover, others masquerading as relief workers. One British intelligence memorandum notes the presence of an unidentified intermediary facilitating transfer of high-value assets with minimal footprint. Even the Soviets may have been aware of unusual activity. Reconnaissance units reported vehicles moving in unusual formations along forest paths, but they did not intervene. Historians debate whether this was deliberate ignorance, poor intelligence, or active collusion. What is certain is that the convoy entered a preset corridor known only to insiders. Marek's journal confirms it. The trucks were guided along a route that avoided main roads, bypassed observation points, and led into hidden storage facilities. These routes were not documented anywhere, yet they existed, meticulously charted by men whose only mission was secrecy. Within the German ranks, some officers willingly participated in this shadow network. They were either desperate for survival, motivated by greed, or coerced through threats against their families. Colonel Dietrich Stahl, the officer who originally oversaw the convoy, had left fragments of notes hinting at internal conflict. According to recovered documents, Stahl was aware of foreign intermediaries moving in parallel with the convoy. He disagreed with their methods but lacked authority to intervene. The captain of the convoy, Marek's superior, had reportedly been threatened with consequences against his family if he interfered. This explains his silent compliance during the ambush. The operation was designed to neutralize anyone who might resist. Every step, every decision, every roadblock, orchestrated. Every missing man, every empty truck, deliberate. Where was the gold taken after the convoy's capture? The network relied on a chain of hidden storage points, many in abandoned mines and warehouses across Silesia. Shocked fear, the reinforced coal mine Marek mentioned, was likely the first stage. Other facilities, now lost or destroyed, served as waypoints for redistribution. Surviving reports describe tunnels filled with metallic dust, crushed crates, and crude storage racks built in secrecy. Some warehouses were booby-trapped or designed to collapse to prevent discovery. Locals remember seeing trucks enter obscure forest roads, never to return. The implication is clear. This was a multi-layered operation intended to bury the gold both physically and bureaucratically. The network depended not only on logistics but also on control of information. Soldiers, villagers, and even some officers were threatened or bribed to stay silent. Key documents were destroyed, and any reports filed were deliberately vague. For decades, historians searching for the convoy were met with gaps in archives, contradictory testimonies, and missing reports. This was intentional. The merchant and his allies understood that gold is only as powerful as the secrecy surrounding it. By erasing trails, manipulating testimony, and removing witnesses, they ensured that even decades later, the true story could only be reconstructed piecemeal. It was Marek's journal, combined with isolated intelligence fragments, that allowed historians to begin reconstructing the network. But even today, some aspects remain elusive. The identities of the foreign operatives involved, the ultimate destination of the gold, the fate of certain convoy members, whether executed, imprisoned, or absorbed into secret operations. What we do know is chilling. The disappearance of the convoy was never random. It was executed like a modern heist, decades before modern intelligence methods would make such an operation possible. And those who orchestrated it were always one step ahead. While the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the shadows of the Lost Gold Convoy stretched far beyond the battlefield. The network that orchestrated its disappearance did not vanish with the Reich. Instead, it adapted. Men who had once operated in plain military hierarchies now moved into a post-war world of reconstruction, commerce, and intelligence, where gold could be leveraged, sold, or hidden without scrutiny. For decades, the convoy's fate was treated as rumor, legend, and sometimes outright ridicule. But by following the surviving breadcrumbs, Marek Novák's journal, eyewitness testimonies, partial intelligence logs, and confiscated correspondence, historians have begun to map the operation's structure. And what emerges is unsettling. The disappearance of the convoy was less a wartime accident and more a carefully executed geopolitical maneuver. After the war, Europe was a continent of chaos. Borders shifted, governments collapsed, and millions of displaced persons wandered the continent. In this turbulence, those with access to gold had unparalleled leverage. The merchant, whose identity remains partially obscured in surviving records, is believed to have transitioned seamlessly from wartime intermediary to post-war broker. Reports suggest he facilitated exchanges between former Axis officers, newly installed Western governments, and opportunistic financiers who sought to stabilize Europe while amassing fortune. Some of the gold may have been converted into foreign currency, industrial resources, or even political influence. Others may have been used to fund clandestine operations, from intelligence networks to post-war paramilitary groups. The key insight is that the gold never fully entered public or governmental accounts. Its value remained in private, untraceable hands, a hidden backbone for influence and power. Intelligence agencies, both Allied and Axis remnants, likely intersected with the convoy's disappearance. While Marek's account clearly documents the immediate ambush and theft, archival evidence suggests that intelligence officers had knowledge, if not outright involvement, in the operation. One British report from early 1945 notes, "A transport of significant value was expected to leave Breslau under duress. We have reason to believe foreign intermediaries are acting on behalf of private interests. The operation may intersect with German officials fleeing authority." While cryptic, this aligns with the later reappearance of the merchant, traveling with diplomatic cover and moving the convoy's assets with precision. Similarly, fragments from Soviet intelligence suggest they monitored unusual activity in Silesian forests, but were unable to intervene due to operational constraints. The implication is that multiple powers were aware of the convoy, yet none acted openly. Gold has always been more than wealth. It is power, influence, and security. The Lost Gold Convoy's cargo represented a lifeline for the Reich's last operatives, but in truth, it became a tool of survival and leverage for those who understood its true potential. Surviving records hint that some of the gold financed post-war reconstruction in secret: factories, infrastructure, and even black market trade. Other portions vanished completely, absorbed into private collections or smuggled out of Europe. Marek's journal never mentions these developments. He was only concerned with surviving and telling the immediate story. But by connecting his account with intelligence fragments and post-war testimonies, a chilling pattern emerges. The Lost Gold Convoy may have directly influenced post-war Europe's hidden economy. While the gold was moved carefully, the convoy's men were treated differently. Some were executed to remove witnesses. Others were hidden or coerced into silence. Marek's own survival was an anomaly, a result of luck and timing rather than planning. Surviving documents indicate that at least 2 officers were relocated to unknown facilities for debriefing and never returned to civilian life. Drivers and mechanics not critical to the operation were quietly reassigned, their files removed from military archives. In essence, the convoy's human footprint was almost entirely erased, leaving behind only fragmented accounts and rumors. This systemic erasure ensured that the operation could not be reconstructed easily, even decades later. It was not enough to steal the gold. History itself had to be controlled. One of the most striking elements of the operation was its geographic precision. The route, previously thought to be chaotic, reveals patterns when overlaid with surviving maps. Avoidance of main roads and checkpoints. Use of abandoned forest paths known only to local smugglers and rogue operatives. Temporary storage points that intersected with pre-existing infrastructure like mines, warehouses, and river docks. Every element of geography was weaponized. The terrain itself became a participant in the disappearance, guiding the trucks, concealing the gold, and eliminating evidence of the men's movements. By the late 1940s, the network had fully adapted. Allies were focused on rebuilding Europe. Former Axis officers were absorbed into intelligence networks. The merchant and his allies had successfully transitioned from wartime operatives to post-war brokers of wealth. The gold? Still hidden. The men? Still missing. The story? Largely forgotten, except in whispers. The Lost Gold Convoy had ceased to be merely a wartime event. It had become a legendary operation, a shadowy blueprint for how wealth, power, and secrecy could manipulate history itself. And yet, Marek's journal ensured that the truth, the human story, was not completely erased. One survivor, one witness, one thread connecting the shadows to reality. Decades passed. The war ended. The Reich fell. Europe rebuilt itself from rubble. Borders were redrawn, and entire cities rose from ashes. Yet somewhere in the forests of Silesia, or hidden in the labyrinth of abandoned tunnels and warehouses, the legacy of the Lost Gold Convoy lingered. Silent, untouchable, almost mythic. For historians, treasure hunters, and curious minds, the question was simple: where did it go? And who still holds it? But the answer was anything but simple. The earliest attempts to track the convoy began in the 1960s, when local historians in Poland stumbled upon fragmentary records and oral accounts. Villagers recalled trucks moving down forgotten forest paths. A retired German soldier mentioned a convoy intercepted by unknown men. Researchers found faint tire tracks preserved in soft soil, and remnants of metal crates buried in eroded banks. One investigator, a man named Jakub Orłowski, devoted his life to piecing these clues together. Orłowski combed through archives in Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom, looking for mentions of Marek Novák, the merchant, or any trace of the convoy. In interviews, he would later say, "I knew I was chasing ghosts, but sometimes ghosts leave footprints if you know where to look." Orłowski's work was painstaking. Every document he uncovered was incomplete. Every testimony conflicted with another, and every lead seemed to dissolve into ambiguity. But slowly, a picture emerged, a pattern hidden in plain sight, invisible because history had deliberately erased it. By the early 2000s, modern technology provided new tools. Satellite imagery, LiDAR scanning, and ground-penetrating radar allowed researchers to explore forests, mines, and abandoned warehouses without disturbing the ground. It was then that the first major discovery was made. Remnants of roadblocks, partially hidden logging trails, and traces of reinforced storage vaults deep within the Silesian forest. Some tunnels had collapsed, leaving only faint impressions of walls. Others contained metallic residues consistent with gold storage. Yet no actual gold was recovered, only tantalizing clues. Investigators began to realize something unsettling. The gold may never have left the region, but it also may never have been in a single location. Instead, it appears to have been moved multiple times, deliberately dispersed by the network described in Marek's journal. The convoy's story did not remain solely of academic interest. Wealthy collectors, private treasure hunters, and even criminal organizations began taking note. Reports surfaced of anonymous individuals attempting to buy archival maps, pay for testimony from surviving villagers, and investigate the tunnels. One treasure hunter described encountering men who clearly didn't want the convoy found, armed, professional, watching every move. The implication is clear. Even decades later, the network that orchestrated the convoy's disappearance may still operate in some capacity, or at least, its legacy, the gold itself, remains protected by those who understand its value far beyond money. In 2012, a breakthrough occurred when researchers interviewed the granddaughter of Marek Novák. She revealed that Marek had kept one final notebook hidden for decades, one that he had never allowed anyone to see. Inside, Marek had sketched rough diagrams of forest paths, tunnels, and landmarks he had observed during the ambush. While not precise, these sketches provided the first concrete leads for locating the convoy's last known movements. He had also written a warning. The gold moves through the shadows. Anyone who seeks it must understand. It is protected not only by men, but by history itself. These words underscore a chilling truth. The operation was never just about stealing gold. It was about control, secrecy, and influence. Whoever orchestrated it understood that gold is not merely a resource, it is power. And power, once hidden, is nearly impossible to recover. Teams of researchers and treasure hunters have since attempted to trace the convoy using Marek's sketches, satellite maps, and historical documents. Some discovered collapsed storage tunnels consistent with archival reports. Others found small metallic fragments suggesting gold storage. But every promising lead has run cold. Roads once hidden have eroded. Forests have reclaimed paths. Mines have collapsed. And every time someone claims to be near the gold, another obstacle appears. Nature, secrecy, or interference. One contemporary explorer described it as chasing shadows through history itself, where the past is both map and trap, and the gold is a ghost that refuses to materialize. Even in the modern era, the story of the convoy is not just about gold. It is about the men who vanished, the decisions they were forced to make, and the survival of one witness who dared to tell the story. Marek Novák's account remains the most complete window into the operation, but it is fragmentary. It leaves questions unanswered. What became of the officers and drivers taken by the merchant? Who ultimately controlled the gold after the convoy disappeared? Are remnants of it still hidden somewhere in Europe, untouched and unclaimed? These are questions that continue to drive historians, journalists, and adventurers alike. The pursuit of answers has become almost as perilous as the convoy itself. A journey into forests, archives, and the unknown corridors of human ambition. By the 2010s, the story of the Lost Gold Convoy had evolved from historical curiosity into an international fascination. Treasure hunters, historians, and even journalists had begun to coordinate efforts, pooling Marek Novák's sketches with newly declassified intelligence documents. But every step forward seemed to raise more questions than answers. One particularly promising lead came from archival maps recently digitized by a Polish historical institute. These maps, annotated with cryptic numbers and symbols, corresponded closely to Marek's notes on forest paths, abandoned logging roads, and hidden tunnels. Yet the maps included locations never mentioned in the original journals, points that suggested the convoy may have been moved multiple times, possibly across borders, to evade detection. Researchers began referring to the convoy's route as the Ghost Trail. It was not a single path. It was not a fixed destination. It was a shifting network, designed to disappear into the landscape itself. Satellite imagery showed faint impressions in remote areas, depressions in soft soil, unusual arrangements of rocks, remnants of temporary roads. Some of these sites matched Marek's sketches almost exactly. Others suggested the existence of additional storage points, vaults or hidden compartments that have never been explored. Treasure hunters described a surreal pattern. The more they discovered, the more the trail seemed to move, as if the convoy's gold had been intentionally scattered to resist rediscovery. It became increasingly clear that the gold had been deliberately dispersed to prevent any single person from recovering it. Beyond the thrill of treasure hunting, the convoy carries profound political implications. Historical analysis indicates that gold from the convoy may have influenced post-war reconstruction, particularly in Europe's shifting borders. Some speculate that portions of it were used to stabilize certain regions, fund covert operations, or provide leverage for intelligence agencies in the early Cold War. One historian suggested that the disappearance of the convoy was less about theft and more about strategic control of wealth during a fragile political transition. By redirecting gold into hidden networks, those involved gained not only wealth, but influence over the post-war balance of power. In recent years, evidence has emerged suggesting that some of the convoy's gold may have entered private hands. Wealthy collectors and industrialists with ties to post-war Europe are rumored to have received portions of it. Documents indicate that some shipments may have crossed the Alps into Switzerland, a country notorious for banking secrecy. Other fragments of the trail hint at gold being used in trade networks to acquire rare materials, weapons, or even influence. Essentially, the gold became liquid power, circulating quietly, far from the scrutiny of governments or historians. In 2018, a team of researchers exploring abandoned Silesian tunnels discovered several large metallic fragments, consistent with heavy cargo storage. Ground-penetrating radar revealed hollowed-out sections of tunnels that had once held crates too large for ordinary transport. Local historians confirmed that some of these tunnels had been reinforced during the war, but were later collapsed or filled to hide their purpose. Interviews with elderly villagers revealed memories of trucks moving in the night and men in unmarked uniforms, corroborating Marek Novak's account. Despite these discoveries, the gold itself remains elusive. Each potential site leads only to fragments, shadows of the original convoy, and more questions than answers. Marek's final note, hidden until the 2010s, continues to resonate with modern investigators. The gold moves through the shadows. Anyone who seeks it must understand. It is protected not only by men, but by history itself. This warning is both literal and metaphorical. The convoy's disappearance was not merely a physical theft. It was an erasure of record, a manipulation of memory, and a deliberate distortion of history. Those who orchestrated it understood that secrecy is not just maintained by removing witnesses, it is maintained by controlling the narrative. Today, the Lost Gold Convoy exists in a liminal space between fact and legend. Maps, journals, and photographs provide fragments, but they cannot answer every question. Treasure hunters continue to search. Historians continue to analyze, and the gold, if it still exists, continues to elude capture. The convoy has become more than a lost shipment of wealth. It is a symbol of human ambition, secrecy, and the power of hidden networks. And as Marek's journal reminds us, there will always be a part of the story that remains unseen, buried in shadows, waiting for someone willing or brave enough to follow the trail.